The moment a trained K9 breaks formation and disappears into the fog, you don't ask why, you run after him. That was the first thought that hit Sergeant Ethan Walker as he stood at the edge of the forest line, watching Shadow vanish into the rolling gray like he had been swallowed by the earth itself. The morning air in the hills outside Fort Ridge, Oregon was cold enough to sting the lungs, carrying the damp scent of pine needles, wet stone, and distant rain that hadn't fully arrived yet. Ethan adjusted the strap on his tactical vest, his boots pressing into soft ground that gave slightly with every step, unsure whether he was following protocol or instinct. Shadow wasn't just any dog. He was a 6-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat that darkened along his back and amber eyes that never missed movement, trained for search and field operations under conditions where human senses failed. But today there had been no command, no signal, no assignment. Just a sudden shift in the dog's behavior, a sharp turn of his head toward the hills, ears locking on as something unseen, followed by a single decisive break into the fog. "Shadow, heel." Ethan called once, his voice firm but already fading into uncertainty as the mist swallowed sound. There was no response, only the faint crunch of unseen movement ahead, like something deliberate pulling the dog forward. Ethan hesitated for half a second, a trained Marine conditioned to evaluate risk and obedience in equal measure, but something in his gut tightened in a way he had learned not to ignore over the years. He pressed forward. The fog thickened quickly as he entered the treeline, reducing the world to shifting shades of gray and green, branches bending under moisture, droplets clinging to his sleeves as he moved. Every step deeper felt like crossing an invisible boundary where familiar terrain turned alien. He remembered the last mission where Shadow had been deployed with him, how the dog had once paused at the edge of danger before anyone else noticed it existed, how instinct had often outrun orders. That memory now sat heavy in his chest as he pushed forward, scanning for movement, listening for anything that might confirm he wasn't chasing a phantom. Then he saw it, faint impressions in the soil, paw prints cutting through damp earth, spaced with urgency but not panic, as if Shadow knew exactly where he was going. Ethan slowed, crouching briefly to study the marks, his fingers brushing the cold ground. Something about them felt intentional, not random wandering. He stood again, exhaling slowly, the fog curling around him like breath from something alive. A distant sound reached him then, faint and fragmented, carried by the wind through the hills, too weak to be understood, but enough to change direction. Shadow had stopped moving straight. The trail shifted sharply east, toward a section of hillside known among locals as unstable terrain, an old logging route long abandoned and swallowed by nature. Ethan felt the weight of that realization settle in his shoulders as he followed the turn, boots slipping slightly on wet rock, catching himself before falling. The fog here was denser, almost tactile, reducing visibility to only a few feet ahead. He raised a hand instinctively to brush moisture from his eyelashes, heart rate steady but alert in a way only years of service could teach. And then, just ahead, Shadow reappeared for a moment, silhouetted against the mist, standing still, head lowered, focused entirely on something beyond Ethan's sight. The dog did not bark, did not move closer. He simply waited, as if confirming that Ethan had followed. There was something different in his posture now, not urgency, but recognition, as though the mission had already begun long before Ethan was aware of it. The Marine took another step forward, and in that single motion the atmosphere shifted, less like following an animal, more like being led by one. The forest seemed quieter now, as if even the wind had slowed to listen. Ethan's training told him to assess, to report, to proceed with caution, but another deeper part of him, the part shaped by years of standing beside Shadow in silence, told him something was waiting in the fog, something that mattered more than procedure. And so he followed, deeper into the hills, into the gray unknown where the line between instinct and purpose began to disappear completely. The deeper Ethan Walker moved into the fog, the more the world around him began to lose its edges, as if the hills themselves were erasing direction and memory with every step forward. The ground beneath his boots shifted from soft forest soil to uneven stone scattered with damp leaves that clung to his soles, slowing his pace without warning. Shadow was no longer visible, But Ethan could feel him somewhere ahead, not by sight but by instinct. The same quiet certainty that had guided them through countless missions where visibility was reduced and time was critical. The Marine paused for a moment, scanning the gray wall in front of him, listening. The forest did not feel empty. It felt held, like something was waiting just beyond perception. He raised his radio instinctively, then lowered it again when he realized there was no signal, only static that dissolved as quickly as it appeared. That silence was heavier than sound. "Shadow," he called again, voice steady but softer now, no longer command, more like a question carried into uncertainty. Somewhere ahead, a faint movement disturbed the fog, and then Shadow emerged briefly, stepping into view before disappearing again, as if confirming the path without offering explanation. Ethan followed. As he continued upward along the narrow incline, the terrain began to change in subtle but noticeable ways. Broken branches lay scattered in patterns that suggested movement through the area, not random windfall. The air grew colder, carrying a faint metallic scent mixed with damp earth, a combination Ethan could not immediately place but instinctively noted. He had learned over years of service that unfamiliar details often mattered most. His training whispered caution, but his trust in Shadow outweighed hesitation. After several minutes of steady climbing, the fog thinned just enough to reveal the outline of an old service road carved into the hillside, partially reclaimed by nature. Rusted metal posts lined portions of it, leaning at uneven angles, their original purpose long forgotten. Shadow stood at the edge of this road now, completely still, his body aligned forward, ears locked in. Attention towards something beyond Ethan's line of sight. For the first time since the break, he did not move when Ethan approached. Instead, he waited, breathing slow and controlled, as though guarding a boundary. Ethan stepped beside him, lowering his gaze to where Shadow was focused. At first, there was nothing visible except mist and distance. Then, gradually, shapes began to form, subtle outlines of man-made structures partially buried in vegetation, weathered and abandoned, their purpose unclear at first glance. Ethan narrowed his eyes, trying to identify what he was seeing. A collapsed maintenance shed, maybe, or an old survey station from decades earlier. Shadow let out a low, restrained sound, not a bark, but something closer to recognition. It was the kind of sound Ethan had only heard when the dog identified something deeply familiar or urgently important. Ethan's attention shifted to the ground again, where the soil showed fresh disturbance, as if something had passed through recently. The realization tightened his focus. This was not an untouched area. Someone or something had been here not long ago. He crouched slightly, placing a hand near the ground without fully touching it, scanning for direction. Shadow stepped closer to the edge of the overgrown structure, then stopped again, waiting. The Marine exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold air, and felt the weight of uncertainty settle deeper into his thoughts. Whatever had drawn Shadow here was not random, and it was not distant. It was close enough to change the meaning of everything he had assumed about this morning. He rose again, adjusting his stance, and took a cautious step forward, following the silent guidance of the only companion who seemed to understand exactly what lay hidden in the fog. The abandoned service road stretched deeper into the fog like a forgotten memory, its cracked asphalt swallowed in places by weeds and scattered pine needles that had gathered over years of silence. Ethan Walker moved carefully along its edge, boots pressing into damp ground where visibility narrowed to just a few feet ahead. Shadow stayed slightly in front now, no longer darting unpredictably, but guiding with a steady, deliberate pace that told Ethan the direction was no longer uncertain. The air felt heavier here, colder in a way that seemed to sink beneath the skin rather than sit on it, and every breath carried the faint scent of rusted metal mixed with wet stone. Ethan kept his focus forward, his instincts sharpening with every step, the trained part of his mind cataloging every detail that did not belong. Broken fence posts lined portions of the road, their paint long faded, leaning at angles that suggested neglect rather than recent damage. In the distance, the faint outline of what looked like a collapsed utility structure emerged through the fog, partially hidden by overgrown brush that had reclaimed the edges of human presence. Shadow slowed as they approached, then stopped completely, his body rigid but not tense, His attention locked forward with an intensity that made Ethan instinctively lower his center of gravity. For a moment, neither of them moved. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath. Then a sound broke through the stillness, faint and irregular, carried through the fog like something trying to reach across distance that should not exist. Ethan immediately raised a hand, signaling silence even though there was no one else to hear it. He listened again, more carefully this time. The sound was not natural to the environment, not wind, not animal movement, but something softer, intermittent, and deliberate enough to suggest awareness. Shadow took a single step forward, then stopped again, as if waiting for permission that Ethan did not fully understand how to give. Ethan followed his gaze toward the structure ahead, now clearer as they closed the distance. It was an old field station, likely used decades ago for surveying or logging operations. Its metal frame partially collapsed and covered in moss and ivy that clung tightly to every surface. The windows were broken, not recently, but over time, edges smoothed by weather and age. There was no sign of recent official activity, but the ground near the entrance told a different story. Ethan knelt slightly, studying faint impressions in the dirt, marks that suggested repeated movement in and out of the area, not hurried but intentional. Shadow moved closer to the entrance, nose low, following a scent trail that seemed to grow stronger with each step. Ethan rose slowly, feeling the shift in atmosphere become more pronounced, as if the fog itself was thinning just enough to reveal that something important was near. He placed a steady hand on Shadow's shoulder for a brief moment, a silent acknowledgement of trust, then released him. Shadow stepped forward first, crossing the threshold into the broken structure without hesitation. Ethan followed closely behind, his eyes adjusting to the dim interior where light filtered weakly through fractured glass and gaps in the roof. Inside, the space was quiet, filled with dust suspended in still air and the faint echo of movement somewhere deeper within the structure. Shadow stood at the center of the room now, head angled toward a corner partially hidden by collapsed debris. Ethan took a cautious step forward, then another, until the outline of what had drawn them here began to take shape. It was not immediately clear at first, only shapes and shadows arranged in a way that suggested care rather than chaos. And then Ethan saw it more clearly, something left behind intentionally, something that carried meaning beyond its physical form. Shadow let out a low, controlled sound, almost like recognition, and in that moment Ethan understood that this was not just a location they had stumbled upon, but a place that had been waiting to be found. The moment Ethan Walker stepped fully into the abandoned field station, the air inside felt different, as if the fog outside had condensed into silence and settled within the walls, pressing against every surface with a heavy stillness that made even breathing feel deliberate. Dust floated in slow motion through thin beams of light breaking through cracks in the ceiling, revealing a space that had once been functional but was now surrendered to time and weather. Shadow moved first, crossing the threshold with quiet certainty, his nose low to the ground, following a scent that seemed to sharpen his focus with every step forward. Ethan stayed close behind, his boots careful on uneven flooring where old wooden panels creaked softly under weight. The interior was partially collapsed, with sections of metal shelving bent inward and scattered equipment left in place as if whoever had been here last intended to return but never did. The faint sound Ethan had heard outside now grew slightly clearer, not louder, but more defined, like a signal struggling through distance. Shadow stopped near the center of the room, his body angled toward a darker corner where debris formed a shallow enclosure against the wall. Ethan's attention followed immediately, his instincts tightening as he assessed the space. At first, all he saw was shadow within shadow, shapes layered in a way that made interpretation difficult, but Shadow's unwavering focus told him everything he needed to know about importance. The Marine lowered himself slightly, moving closer with controlled caution, each step measured and deliberate. As he approached, the outline of something resting against the debris became visible, something that did not belong to the decay of the structure. It was a figure, still and quiet, positioned carefully rather than collapsed, as if placed there with intention or preserved by circumstance. Ethan paused for a moment, scanning for movement, then slowly stepped closer again. The figure shifted faintly, a subtle motion that confirmed life, though weakened by exhaustion or prolonged exposure. Shadow immediately lowered himself beside it, his posture softening in a way Ethan recognized from previous operations, when the dog had found survivors in conditions that required patience rather than urgency. Ethan exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly as he realized they were not too late. He moved closer, now able to see more clearly that the figure was a man, dressed in worn outdoor clothing layered for weather that had clearly not been sufficient for the conditions outside. His face was partially obscured, but his breathing was steady, though shallow, suggesting fatigue rather than immediate danger. Ethan knelt beside him, speaking softly in a calm tone designed not to startle. The man responded with a faint movement of his head, eyes opening slowly as if adjusting to the presence of someone unexpected. Shadow remained close, his attention divided between the man and the surrounding space, as though still confirming safety through scent and instinct. Ethan carefully assessed the situation, noting no visible injuries requiring immediate intervention, but clear signs of dehydration and prolonged disorientation. He reached for his radio again, remembering the lack of signal outside, then set it aside without frustration, focusing instead on stabilizing presence and awareness. The man's gaze shifted toward Shadow, and something subtle changed in his expression, a flicker of recognition or relief that suggested this was not the first time he had relied on a dog for survival or guidance. Shadow responded by leaning slightly forward, pressing close in a gesture that was not trained command but instinctive reassurance. Ethan watched the interaction quietly, understanding that whatever had brought them here was not random chance, but something far more intentional, as if the dog had been following a memory rather than a trail. The fog outside pressed against the broken windows, but inside the structure, a fragile sense of stillness replaced uncertainty. Ethan remained kneeling, steady and observant, while Shadow continued to hold position beside the man, as though anchoring him to the present moment. In that quiet exchange, there was no urgency of rescue yet, only the beginning of understanding that what they had found was connected to something deeper than a simple search, something that had been waiting in the hills for exactly this moment to be discovered. The silence inside the collapsed field station held for several seconds after Ethan Walker settled beside the injured man, as if the entire structure itself was waiting to understand whether the moment required alarm or calm. Dust continued to drift through fractured beams of light, but even that movement felt slower now, softened by the absence of urgency. Shadow remained close to the man's side, his posture steady, eyes attentive, breathing controlled in a way that reflected training, but also something deeper, something closer to recognition. Ethan observed quietly, his attention moving between the man's face and the dog's behavior, noting how Shadow refused to leave even a few inches of space between them. The man shifted slightly again, blinking as his awareness returned in fragments. His voice, when it came, was low and dry, carrying the weight of fatigue rather than confusion. Ethan leaned forward slightly, keeping his tone steady and calm, identifying himself clearly and asking simple questions designed to orient rather than overwhelm. The man responded slowly, as if each word required effort, but there was coherence in his answers, enough to confirm he was conscious and stable. He explained that he had been hiking through the hills earlier that morning, following a familiar route he had used years before, but the fog had come in faster than expected, erasing landmarks and disorienting direction until he eventually sought shelter inside the structure. His explanation was simple, but something in the way he spoke suggested that the decision to enter had not been entirely voluntary, as if guided by something he trusted more than visibility. Shadow suddenly lifted his head slightly at that moment, his ears angling toward the man's voice, then toward a small object partially visible near the debris beside him. Ethan followed the direction of the dog's attention and noticed a worn fabric strap attached to what appeared to be an old identification tag, partially buried under dust and wood fragments. He carefully reached forward and retrieved it, brushing away debris to reveal faded lettering that suggested a military origin, though time had made it difficult to read fully. The man's eyes shifted toward the object, and for the first time since they had arrived, something like recognition passed through his expression. He inhaled slowly, and Ethan noticed his hands tighten slightly against the floor, not in fear, but in memory. Shadow moved closer to the tag, sniffing it briefly before sitting back on his haunches, his posture still and focused, as if confirming a connection that words had not yet explained. Ethan remained silent for a moment, allowing the atmosphere to settle around the realization that this was not simply a stranded hiker, but someone whose past carried weight in places that could not be immediately understood. The fog outside pressed faintly against the broken walls, but inside, the space felt suspended in a moment of quiet recognition. Ethan spoke again, more gently this time, asking if the man remembered how long he had been here. The man hesitated before answering, stating that time had become difficult to measure, that he remembered following something familiar into the hills, something that felt less like direction and more like certainty. Shadow reacted subtly at those words, shifting his gaze toward the entrance as if recalling the path that had brought them here. Ethan considered this carefully, his mind moving through possibilities without rushing to conclusions. What mattered now was not interpretation but stability, ensuring the man could safely be moved once conditions allowed. He checked the man's pulse again, noting steadiness despite exhaustion, then adjusted his position slightly to block the colder draft entering through the broken structure. Shadow remained unwavering beside them, his presence constant, as if refusing to allow the man to feel alone again even for a moment. In the quiet that followed, Ethan began to understand that the reason Shadow had entered the fog was not random instinct alone, but something tied to memory, recognition, and an unspoken bond that extended beyond the present moment. Whatever had brought them here had not ended at discovery, but had only begun to reveal its meaning in fragments of silence and connection. The interior of the abandoned field station seemed to grow quieter as Ethan Walker remained seated beside the injured man, as if the structure itself had accepted the presence of life inside it and was no longer resisting it with silence. Dust continued to drift through fractured beams of light, but even the movement of particles felt subdued, almost respectful. Shadow stayed in the same position, unwavering, his body angled slightly toward the man, while his attention remained divided between the entrance and the deeper corners of the room. Ethan maintained steady control of the situation, his posture relaxed but alert, the trained discipline of a United States Marine shaping every movement and observation. The man shifted again, more stable now, his breathing evening out as the initial shock of disorientation faded. Ethan offered a small canteen from his pack, allowing the man to take slow, measured sips rather than rushing, ensuring his recovery remained controlled. The man accepted it with quiet gratitude, his hands trembling slightly, but gaining strength with each moment. Shadow did not move closer during this exchange, but his ears remained forward, tracking every subtle sound, every shift in breath, every change in tone. Ethan noticed this behavior and studied it carefully, realizing that Shadow was not only responding to the man, but to something embedded in the environment itself, something deeper than physical presence. After several minutes, the man spoke again, his voice clearer now, though still marked by exhaustion. He explained that he had not been alone in his journey through the hills. There had been moments, brief and difficult to explain, where he felt guided rather than lost, as if something familiar had been leading him toward this exact place long before he understood why. Ethan listened without interruption, his attention fully engaged, recognizing that such statements often came from individuals who had spent too long in isolation or under extreme environmental stress, but he did not dismiss them. Instead, he observed Shadow's reaction. The dog had become completely still, his gaze fixed not on the man now, but on the space just beyond him, as if remembering something that words could not fully capture. Ethan followed that gaze and noticed a small patch of fabric caught beneath a collapsed beam near the wall. He carefully reached forward and retrieved it, revealing a faded military unit patch, worn almost beyond recognition, but still carrying faint markings that suggested service history. The moment Shadow saw it, his posture changed subtly, not in tension but in recognition, a quiet shift that Ethan had only witnessed a few times before in high-stakes recovery operations. The man's eyes followed the object in Ethan's hand, and a long pause settled over the room. When he finally spoke again, his tone carried something different, not confusion, but memory resurfacing slowly through distance. He mentioned a unit, a deployment, and a period of service that aligned loosely with Ethan's own understanding of past operations in similar terrain. Ethan remained composed, though internally he began connecting details that suggested this encounter was not accidental but tied to a chain of events that had not been fully visible until now. Shadow stepped forward slightly, placing himself between Ethan and the man for a brief moment, not as a barrier, but as a bridge, as if confirming that both were part of the same unresolved thread. The fog outside thickened again, pressing gently against the broken walls, but inside the structure there was a growing sense of convergence, as if separate paths had finally met at a point that had been waiting for recognition. Ethan adjusted his position, ensuring the man was stable and warm enough for continued recovery, while Shadow remained close, his presence steady and grounded, reinforcing a quiet certainty that what had been lost was not entirely gone, only waiting to be found in a place where memory and instinct had already chosen to meet. The atmosphere inside the abandoned field station had shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible at first, as if the structure itself had begun to accept that what was happening within its walls was not intrusion but resolution. Ethan Walker remained steady beside the injured man, maintaining calm control over the situation while monitoring subtle changes in breathing, posture, and awareness. The man's condition had stabilized further, his speech now more consistent, though still marked by exhaustion and fragments of memory that surfaced without order. Shadow stayed close, no longer scanning the room with urgency, but with a focused stillness that suggested deep internal recognition. His presence was no longer reactive but intentional, as if confirming something that had already been known before arrival. Ethan noticed this shift clearly and remained silent, allowing the moment to unfold without interference. The man shifted slightly again, now able to sit more upright, his gaze moving between Ethan and Shadow with growing clarity. He spoke slowly, explaining that his time in the hills had not been planned as an extended stay, but rather a short return to familiar terrain that held personal meaning. He described a sense of direction he could not fully explain, a feeling that had guided him through fog and uncertainty until he reached this structure, as if something familiar had been pulling him forward rather than allowing him to drift further away. Ethan listened carefully, recognizing patterns in the description that aligned with psychological responses to isolation and environmental disorientation, yet he did not dismiss the emotional certainty behind the man's words. Shadow reacted again at specific points in the conversation, especially when the man mentioned familiarity rather than fear. The dog's ears angled forward slightly, and his posture shifted in subtle confirmation, as though each word was reinforcing an internal map only he could fully interpret. Ethan followed Shadow's gaze once more, noticing how the dog occasionally looked toward the entrance, then back toward the man, as if maintaining a connection between 2 points that were no longer separate. The silence inside the structure became heavier, not with tension, but with meaning accumulating slowly over time. Ethan adjusted his position to ensure the man remained comfortable, checking his breathing and ensuring he was no longer at risk from exposure. The man's strength was returning gradually, though fatigue still shaped his movements. He spoke again, this time referencing a name that caused a noticeable shift in Shadow's behavior. The dog's body tensed slightly, not in aggression or alarm, but in recognition that was immediate and deeply rooted. Ethan observed this carefully, noting that it was the first clear emotional response from Shadow since entering the structure beyond search behavior. The man repeated the name softly, as if testing whether it belonged to memory or imagination. Shadow responded by taking a single step forward, then stopping, his gaze fixed on the man within. Intensity that suggested layered understanding. Ethan remained still, recognizing that whatever connection existed here was not new but resurfacing from a shared past that had not yet been fully revealed. The man lowered his eyes briefly, as if recalling something difficult to place in time, then exhaled slowly. He described fragments of service, distant locations, and moments that did not initially seem connected, but gradually formed a pattern that Ethan began to recognize in broader context. Shadow stayed close throughout, his presence steady, grounding the space between memory and reality. The fog outside continued to press against the broken structure, but inside, the moment felt suspended, as if all 3 presences had converged at a point where past experience and present reality were no longer separate. Ethan understood then that what Shadow had followed into the hills was not simply a physical trail, but a convergence of recognition that had been waiting for all of them to arrive at the same place, at the same time, for reasons that were only now beginning to take shape. The silence inside the abandoned field station had deepened into something almost structured, as if every breath, every glance, and every small movement had settled into a shared understanding that required no immediate explanation. Ethan Walker remained steady beside the man, maintaining a controlled posture that balanced awareness with calm presence. The man's strength had improved slightly, enough that he could sit without support, though fatigue still shaped the rhythm of his breathing. Shadow remained close, positioned slightly forward, his attention no longer divided between search and environment, but anchored entirely to the man in front of him. There was a stillness in the dog that Ethan recognized from rare moments in past operations, when instinct had completed its work and certainty replaced pursuit. The man spoke again, his voice lower now but more coherent, as if something within him had settled into place alongside memory. He described a sequence of events that did not begin in the hills, but far earlier, in a period of service that carried emotional weight rather than operational detail. Ethan listened without interruption, his focus sharp but controlled, noting how the man's recollection was not fragmented in the way disorientation typically produced, but instead layered, as if multiple moments were overlapping into a single continuous thread. Shadow responded subtly to specific references, especially when the man mentioned long periods of separation and silence. The dog's posture shifted slightly each time, not in reaction to threat, but in recognition of emotional patterns that aligned with memory rather than immediate environment. Ethan observed this closely, beginning to understand that Shadow was not simply responding to present stimuli, but to something embedded in shared history that extended beyond this encounter. The man paused briefly, then looked directly at Shadow for a prolonged moment. In that silence, something unspoken passed between them, not through movement or sound, but through recognition that seemed to exist outside of language. Shadow did not break eye contact, holding steady in a way that conveyed certainty without explanation. Ethan felt the atmosphere of the room change again, not physically, but in perception, as if the structure itself had shifted from a place of discovery to a place of confirmation. The man finally exhaled deeply, his shoulders lowering slightly, as if releasing tension he had carried without awareness. He spoke Shadow's name softly, and this time there was no hesitation in the response. The dog stepped forward slowly, closing the distance between them, then stopped just within reach, remaining still as if waiting for permission that did not need to be given. Ethan remained where he was, observing without interference, recognizing that what was unfolding was not part of protocol or procedure, but something far more personal and enduring. The man raised a hand slightly, then paused before making contact, as if unsure whether the moment was real or imagined. When Shadow leaned forward gently, the connection was immediate and calm, not driven by urgency, but by recognition that had survived distance, time, and uncertainty. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly, allowing the moment to exist, without observation pressure, then turned his attention toward the broken entrance where fog still lingered outside. The contrast between the quiet inside and the shifting gray outside felt significant, as if two worlds had briefly overlapped and now existed in fragile balance. The man spoke again, but more softly, acknowledging fragments of memory that now aligned with presence rather than confusion. Ethan listened, understanding that what had brought them here was not merely circumstance or environmental chance, but a convergence shaped by history, instinct, and the silent persistence of connection. Shadow remained still, maintaining contact through presence rather than movement, as if confirming that nothing essential had been lost, only separated temporarily by distance and time. In that shared stillness, the boundaries between past and present, between search and discovery, and between uncertainty and understanding began to dissolve into something quietly complete. The field station no longer felt like a place of discovery, but like a place of resolution, as if every fragment of silence within its broken walls had finally aligned into meaning. Ethan Walker stood quietly near the entrance, his posture steady, his attention divided between the man recovering inside and the fog slowly thinning outside the fractured opening. The air carried a subtle shift now, less heavy than before, as though the environment itself had released tension it no longer needed to hold. Shadow remained close to the man, no longer moving with investigative intent, but with calm presence, his body relaxed yet attentive in a way that suggested full awareness without urgency. The man sat more upright now, his breathing steady and controlled, his strength returning in measured stages. His eyes moved between Ethan and Shadow, no longer searching for explanation, but acknowledging understanding that did not require words. Ethan observed both of them in silence, recognizing that what had unfolded was not a sequence of isolated events, but a convergence that had been building long before any of them arrived. The man spoke softly, his voice now grounded, describing how certain moments in his memory had always felt incomplete until this one, as if pieces of experience had been separated by time and distance, but were now returning to their natural alignment. Shadow responded by shifting slightly closer, resting near the man without hesitation, his presence no longer analytical but familiar. Ethan noticed this and allowed himself to step back slightly, giving space to the connection that had formed without instruction or intervention. The fog outside continued to move across the hillside, visible through the broken structure like slow waves passing through a distant shoreline, but inside, everything felt anchored. The man exhaled deeply and lowered his gaze for a moment, then looked at Shadow again with quiet recognition that carried no confusion, only acceptance. Ethan adjusted his position near the entrance, scanning briefly outside out of habit, but his focus remained inward, aware that the significance of this moment extended beyond the physical environment. Shadow stayed still, maintaining contact through presence alone, as if confirming that nothing essential had been lost, only separated temporarily by circumstance. The man spoke one final time, his tone calm and certain, acknowledging that whatever had guided him into the hills had not been random, but connected to something that had remained with him even in absence. Ethan listened without interruption, understanding that there were moments in field experience where explanation became secondary to recognition, where the truth of an encounter was measured not in data but in alignment. Shadow remained beside the man, steady and unwavering, his role no longer defined by search or recovery, but by reunion that required no further action. The silence that followed was not empty but complete, holding within it the weight of everything that had led them to this point without the need for further pursuit. Outside, the fog continued to lift slowly from the hills, revealing the faint outline of distance beyond the structure, but inside, nothing needed to be chased anymore, because what had been found had already settled into place.